the system that broke. On November 12, 2019, inside one of America's largest jails, something happened that officials still struggle to fully explain. Entire sections of the facility went dark. Doors that were supposed to stay locked malfunctioned. Surveillance cameras stopped recording. And for several terrifying hours, control inside Chicago's Cook County Jail didn't belong to the authorities anymore. But that wasn't even the most disturbing part. Because according to internal reports and multiple inmate accounts, this wasn't a one-time failure. It was the result of a system that had been quietly falling apart for years, until it finally snapped. Cook County Jail isn't just any detention center. It's one of the largest single-site jails in the United States, holding thousands of detainees at any given time, most of them awaiting trial, not yet convicted of a crime. On paper, it's designed to maintain strict order through layered security, constant surveillance, and controlled movement. But behind those concrete walls, a very different reality has been documented. Overcrowding, understaffing, broken infrastructure, and a growing sense that the people inside were being pushed to a breaking point. According to reports from watchdog organizations and court filings, the jail has faced repeated criticism for its conditions. Cells built for one person often held two or more. Basic services, like medical care and sanitation, were stretched thin. And correctional officers were frequently outnumbered, working long shifts in an environment where tension was always just below the surface. Inmates described it as unpredictable. Officers described it as unsustainable. And administrators? They insisted it was under control. But then came a series of incidents that began to tell a different story. In early 2019, internal logs showed a spike in violent altercations across multiple divisions. Fights were breaking out more frequently. Response times were getting slower. And in some cases, entire tiers had to be locked down for extended periods just to restore order. One correctional officer, speaking anonymously in a later interview, described the atmosphere bluntly: "You could feel it building, like pressure in a pipe. And nobody knew when it was going to burst." At the same time, maintenance reports revealed another critical issue: failing infrastructure. Electronic door systems were malfunctioning. Communication systems were unreliable. And surveillance equipment, the backbone of any modern jail, had significant blind spots due to outdated or broken cameras. That meant something dangerous. There were moments, real documented moments, when parts of the jail couldn't be properly monitored. And that's exactly where things started to spiral. Because in an environment like Cook County Jail, control isn't just about physical barriers. It's about visibility, awareness, the ability to respond instantly when something goes wrong. Take that away, even briefly, and the balance shifts. Inmate testimonies later described how certain areas of the jail became unofficial zones during outages or system failures. Places where supervision dropped. Where rules were enforced less consistently. Where conflicts could escalate without immediate intervention. It didn't take long for people to notice. And once they did, the dynamic inside the jail began to change. According to multiple accounts, groups started testing boundaries, pushing against restrictions, observing how staff responded, and identifying weaknesses in the system. It wasn't organized in the way movies portray prison riots. It was more subtle than that. A slow erosion of authority. A quiet understanding that the system wasn't as solid as it appeared. And then the tipping point. On that November day when systems failed across multiple sections, the fragile balance inside Cook County Jail collapsed. Reports indicate that electronic locks in certain areas either delayed or failed to respond. Officers had difficulty coordinating due to communication issues. And for a period of time, movement inside parts of the facility became unpredictable. Officials later stated that order was restored without a full-scale riot. But that statement doesn't tell the whole story. Because what happened during those hours exposed something far more serious than a temporary malfunction. It revealed just how close the system had come to losing control entirely. Multiple detainees later described the atmosphere during the outage as chaotic and uncertain. Some stayed locked in their cells, unsure of what was happening. Others reported hearing shouting, banging, and movement in areas that were normally tightly controlled. And correctional staff? They were operating in the dark, both literally and figuratively. Trying to manage thousands of detainees in a facility where key systems were no longer reliable. According to follow-up investigations, the incident forced administrators to confront a reality they had long tried to manage quietly. The infrastructure wasn't just outdated, it was failing. And the human system built around it was stretched beyond its limits. But here's where it gets even more unsettling. Because when investigators started digging deeper, they found that this wasn't an isolated incident. There had been warnings, maintenance requests, internal complaints, even legal actions pointing to systemic issues within the jail. Warnings that, in many cases, hadn't been fully addressed. Which raises a critical question. If the signs were there, if the risks were known, why wasn't more done before things reached that point? And more importantly, how many other moments like this happen without ever making headlines? Because inside Cook County Jail, control isn't just something you establish once. It's something you have to maintain, every second, every day across every cell block and corridor. And when that control starts to slip even slightly, the consequences can escalate faster than anyone expects. By the time order was officially restored that day, the immediate crisis was over. But the underlying problem remained. A system under strain. A facility operating at the edge of its capacity. And a growing concern among both staff and detainees that what happened once could happen again. And maybe next time, they wouldn't be able to contain it. Because what November 12th revealed wasn't just a failure of technology. It was a warning. A glimpse into what happens when one of America's largest jails begins to lose its grip. Not all at once, but piece by piece, failure by failure, until the line between order and chaos starts to disappear. And the most disturbing part? That line might have already been crossed, more times than anyone is willing to admit. When control started slipping. After the November 2019 failure, officials at Cook County Jail moved quickly to reassure the public. Statements emphasized that order had been restored, that protocols had worked, that there was no widespread breach of security. But inside the jail, the narrative was very different. Because for the officers and detainees who experienced those hours firsthand, the incident didn't feel like a contained malfunction. It felt like a warning shot. And in the months that followed, that warning started to become reality. According to internal reports and independent investigations, the problems inside Cook County Jail didn't begin in 2019, and they certainly didn't end there. In fact, what happened that day was just one moment in a much larger pattern of instability that had been building for years. Overcrowding remained one of the most persistent issues. Despite efforts to reduce the jail population, thousands of detainees were still housed in a facility originally designed under very different conditions. Housing units meant to operate under strict supervision were now stretched thin, with fewer officers responsible for more inmates. And that imbalance created something dangerous. Gaps. Gaps in supervision. Gaps in response time. Gaps in control. Correctional officers began reporting that they were increasingly unable to monitor all areas effectively. In some divisions, a single officer might be responsible for overseeing dozens of detainees at once. When incidents broke out, backup wasn't always immediate. And in a place like Cook County Jail, seconds matter. One former detainee later described the environment as controlled chaos. There were rules, yes. There were routines. But underneath it all was a constant sense that things could shift at any moment. That tension only grew as new challenges emerged. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit correctional facilities across the United States hard, and Cook County Jail was no exception. At one point, it became one of the largest known clusters of the virus in the country, according to public health reports. Quarantine measures were introduced. Movement was restricted even further. Entire sections were locked down for extended periods. On the surface, that might sound like increased control. In reality, it created new problems. Detainees were confined to their cells for longer hours, often with limited access to basic services. Programs were suspended. Court dates were delayed. Uncertainty grew. And with uncertainty came frustration. Officers, meanwhile, were dealing with their own crisis. Staffing shortages worsened as personnel fell ill or were required to quarantine. Those who remained were stretched even thinner, working longer shifts under increasingly stressful conditions. The balance inside the jail, already fragile, was pushed even closer to the edge. Reports from advocacy groups and legal filings during this period began to highlight a troubling trend: rising complaints about use of force, delayed medical care, and deteriorating living conditions. But perhaps more concerning were the accounts of what was happening in the shadows. Because as official attention focused on managing the pandemic, some of the underlying issues that had contributed to the 2019 failure were quietly getting worse. Maintenance delays increased. Infrastructure problems went unresolved. And in certain areas, surveillance coverage remained inconsistent. That meant the same vulnerabilities that had been exposed before were still there. And people inside the jail knew it. According to multiple testimonies, detainees began adapting to the new reality. Informal systems developed, unwritten rules about which areas to avoid, which times were safest, and how to navigate a facility where official control wasn't always consistent. It wasn't open rebellion. It was something more subtle. A shift in power dynamics. Because in any controlled environment, authority depends on predictability. On the idea that rules are enforced consistently and consequences are certain. When that predictability disappears even slightly, everything changes. And that's exactly what was happening inside Cook County Jail. One incident in particular, detailed in later reports, illustrates just how fragile the situation had become. In a housing division already flagged for staffing shortages, a routine disturbance escalated faster than expected. What began as a verbal altercation between detainees turned into a physical confrontation. Officers responded, but not immediately. Backup was delayed. By the time order was restored, multiple individuals had been injured. Officially, it was classified as an isolated incident. But internally it raised serious concerns. Because it wasn't the first time response delays had been documented. And it wouldn't be the last. As investigators continued to examine conditions inside the jail, a pattern began to emerge. Not of a single catastrophic failure, but of repeated, smaller breakdowns. Each one manageable on its own. Each one contained. But together, they painted a very different picture. A system under constant strain. A facility operating closer and closer to its limits. And a growing risk that one day those limits would be exceeded. What makes this even more complicated is that Cook County Jail wasn't ignoring these issues entirely. Efforts were being made, policy changes, oversight measures, attempts to modernize certain systems. But progress was uneven. And in an environment where conditions can change rapidly, uneven progress isn't always enough. Because while improvements were happening in some areas, others were falling behind. And inside the jail, those inconsistencies didn't go unnoticed. Detainees talked. Officers shared concerns. Patterns were observed. The question wasn't whether the system had weaknesses. Everyone already knew that. The real question was how far those weaknesses could be pushed before something irreversible happened. Because history has shown that in large correctional facilities, loss of control doesn't always come from a single dramatic event. Sometimes it builds slowly, piece by piece, until one day the system doesn't just bend. It breaks. And that brings us to the most critical question of all. What happens when a facility this large, this complex, and this strained, finally reaches that breaking point? Because according to some reports and insider accounts, there were moments, real moments, when Cook County Jail came closer to that edge than the public ever realized. Moments that never made headlines. Moments that were contained just in time. And moments that suggest the events of November 2019 might not have been the worst-case scenario, just the preview. The edge of collapse. By the time investigators, journalists, and oversight bodies began piecing everything together, one thing had become clear. Cook County Jail hadn't lost control all at once. It had been losing it slowly. And in some ways it still was. Because what the public saw, isolated incidents, official statements, brief headlines, was only a fraction of the full picture. Behind the scenes, the reality was far more complex and far more concerning. According to reports from the U.S. Department of Justice and independent monitoring groups, Cook County Jail had been under scrutiny for years. Concerns about excessive force, inadequate mental health care, and unsafe conditions weren't new. In fact, some dated back over a decade. There had been reforms, court orders, oversight agreements. But the system itself? It remained under constant pressure. One of the most significant challenges was something that couldn't be fixed overnight: the sheer scale of the facility. Cook County Jail isn't a single building, it's a network of divisions, each with its own population, staffing needs, and operational demands. Managing that kind of environment requires precision, consistency, and above all, control. But as the previous incidents revealed, maintaining that level of control wasn't always possible. Especially when multiple systems, human and mechanical, were under strain at the same time. Take the issue of staffing. Even before the pandemic, correctional facilities across the United States were facing recruitment and retention challenges. Cook County Jail was no exception. When staffing levels drop, the effects ripple through the entire system. Fewer officers means less supervision. Less supervision means slower response times. And slower response times? That's where small problems turn into serious incidents. Add to that the ongoing infrastructure issues, aging equipment, unreliable systems, maintenance backlogs, and you have a situation where even well-trained staff are working with limited tools. It's not just about discipline. It's about capability. And that distinction matters. Because when something goes wrong inside a jail, the expectation is immediate control, immediate response, immediate containment. But what happens when immediate isn't possible? That question became more urgent as additional accounts surfaced. Some from detainees, others from staff, describing moments where control wasn't completely lost, but it was dangerously close. Moments where communication broke down. Moments where supervision gaps were exploited. Moments where the system held, but only just. One former officer described it like this: people think it's either calm or chaos. It's not. There's a middle ground where things are technically under control, but barely. That's where we were a lot of the time. That middle ground is where Cook County Jail operated more often than many realized. And it's also where the biggest risks existed. Because when a system is stable, it can absorb pressure. When it's unstable, even small disruptions can have outsized effects. And Cook County Jail, by multiple accounts, was operating in a state of constant instability. But here's the part that changes everything. Despite all of this, the warnings, the incidents, the investigations, the system didn't collapse. There was no full-scale takeover. No uncontrollable riot that made national headlines. No single event that forced an immediate, dramatic overhaul. Instead, what happened was something quieter, more subtle, and arguably more dangerous. The system adapted. Procedures were adjusted. Resources were reallocated. Staff learned to navigate the limitations. Detainees learned to survive within them. On the surface, it looked like resilience. But underneath, the same vulnerabilities remained. And that raises a difficult question. Is a system truly in control if it's constantly operating at the edge of failure? Or is it simply managing the appearance of control while the underlying risks continue to grow? Because the story of Cook County Jail isn't just about one incident in 2019. It's about a pattern. A series of warning signs that, taken together, paint a picture of a facility under continuous strain. And while efforts to improve conditions have been documented, new policies, increased oversight, attempts at modernization, the challenge is ongoing. There's no single fix. No simple solution. Just a complex system trying to function under difficult conditions. For the people inside, both detainees and staff, that reality is something they live with every day. Every locked door. Every delayed response. Every moment of uncertainty. And for those on the outside, it raises an important point. Because Cook County Jail isn't unique. Many large correctional facilities face similar challenges: overcrowding, staffing shortages, aging infrastructure. The difference is how those challenges are managed, and what happens when they aren't. The events of November 12, 2019, offered a rare glimpse behind the curtain. A moment where the system's weaknesses became visible. A moment where control wasn't guaranteed. And a moment that forced a difficult conversation about what it really takes to maintain order in one of the largest jails in America. So what's changed since then? Some improvements have been reported. Oversight has increased. Awareness has grown. But the core question remains. Not just for Cook County Jail, but for correctional systems everywhere. How do you maintain control in an environment where pressure never disappears, only shifts? Because as long as those pressures exist, the risk never fully goes away. Just waits for the next failure, the next delay, the next moment when the system is pushed just a little too far. And when that moment comes, will it hold? Or will everything finally tip over the edge? That's a question no official report can fully answer. Only time can.